and in so many people's. I mean, even when I was in makeup just now, somebody came up almost crying, saying how much they...
A live international television broadcast from Althorpe House came to a sudden, chaotic halt when Charles Spencer pulled a sealed legal document from his breast pocket. It was early 2026, and millions of viewers watched in absolute shock as Diana's brother read her final, unedited wish regarding the royal line of succession. Within seconds, the live broadcast signal inside the BBC master control room was abruptly terminated, plunging the screen into darkness. Earl Spencer hadn't just made an emotional statement, he had introduced concrete, hidden evidence that completely paralyzed the current administration. This single live disclosure didn't just break the palace silence, it instantly shattered the institutional trust between the king and the public. The unrehearsed disclosure. The red tally light on camera, two flickered on, broadcasting live from the portrait gallery at Althorpe House. Charles Spencer sat in a green velvet armchair, facing a senior interviewer from the BBC. It was a standard Tuesday evening in early 2026. The interview was scheduled as a routine retrospective piece marking the anniversary of the estate's historical restoration fund. A technical layout sheet sat on the floor near the teleprompter, listing a pre-approved sequence of 6 questions about architecture and landscaping. For the first 12 minutes, the broadcast followed the standard television protocol, with the Earl discussing the upkeep of the family burial grounds. But as the clock neared the quarter-hour mark, Spencer reached into his charcoal suit jacket and pulled out a single, tri-folded piece of vellum paper. The structural facts of live network broadcasting are governed by strict emergency delay regulations. Under the Communications Act, 2003, major British networks utilize a mandatory 7-second audio buffer during live feeds to prevent accidental profanity or defamatory statements from reaching the public airwaves. The production team in the mobile control truck outside the estate had their fingers resting directly over the master override panel, but they were expecting a technical glitch, not a sudden legal declaration from a peer of the realm. The tension in the gallery turned critical as Spencer opened the paper under the studio lights, ignoring the interviewer's next question about the estate gardens. He leaned toward the microphone and began reading a direct transcript of a message written by Princess Diana just days before her death in 1997. The text was an explicit, unedited directive regarding the future distribution of her personal diaries and the true custody arrangement of her lineage. The floor manager, Sarah Jenkins, began waving her arms frantically behind the camera line, signaling the host to cut to a commercial break. The main video switcher in London showed an immediate spike in viewer data as social media algorithms began tracking the unexpected disclosure in real time. The palace press office had not been briefed on this document, meaning the live feed was airing completely unvetted material to a global audience of millions. A sudden confrontation broke out at the rear entrance of the gallery room. 2 plainclothes press liaisons, who had arrived with the media convoy from London, stepped forward to physically block the main camera lens with a black clipboard. They claimed that the document Spencer was reading violated a standing non-disclosure injunction held by the High Court of Justice. The Earl did not stop reading his text. He looked directly at his private security staff standing by the fireplace and ordered them to immediately clear the room of all outside administrative personnel. The House security team, operating under the absolute property laws governing private English estates, forced the palace liaisons out into the courtyard, allowing the camera crew to maintain their live broadcast link without further physical interference. The mystery of how a sealed document from 1997 had avoided the massive palace archival purges of the early 2000s emerged instantly on screen. Spencer turned the vellum sheet over, showing the camera a unique red ink registration stamp belonging to a private probate registry in the city of Geneva. The paper had never been stored within the jurisdiction of the British Crown or the domestic legal system. Diana had used an international trust executor to bypass the standard UK probate laws entirely. The document's hiding place immediately opened a far more dangerous institutional crisis for the current royal administration. The text Spencer read aloud stated that if her children were ever separated from their maternal family's direct oversight during their minority, a specific financial penalty clause would automatically trigger against the private funds of the Duchy of Lancaster. The princess had legally weaponized her inheritance to ensure the Spencer family maintained a permanent, structural veto over the institutional management of her sons' early lives. The main broadcast signal inside the BBC master control room in London was abruptly terminated at exactly 20 minutes past 8. The live video feed cut to a generic standby screen showing a technical difficulties notice, followed quickly by a pre-recorded nature documentary. The intervention had come from the upper management of the network, but the 7-minute window had already allowed the core text of the final wish to be recorded and downloaded by thousands of viewers online. William's communication director at Kensington Palace immediately initialized an emergency operational protocol, freezing all outgoing statements from the prince's staff. The balance of public trust had completely cracked within the span of a single television segment. The public was now in possession of an official, internationally verified document that directly challenged 30 years of palace statements regarding the family's internal agreements. The corresponding administrative logs from the global network servers verified that over 4 million data downloads of the unedited vellum text occurred within 90 seconds of the broadcast freeze. The data map showed that the primary distribution points were anchored in cloud servers outside the United Kingdom, rendering any domestic palace takedown notices completely useless under current international digital infrastructure acts. The legal departments at Buckingham Palace instantly activated their emergency liaison panels, placing the Crown's senior constitutional solicitors on immediate standby notice. If Spencer integrated this newly revealed Geneva text into the active public domain, the document would immediately become a matter of statutory review for the parliamentary oversight committees currently auditing the sovereign's private asset allocations. The situation became critical when a secondary notification confirmed that a major news agency in New York was preparing to print the full, unredacted financial annexes mentioned in the Earl's speech. The file history showed that these annexes contained explicit transaction codes mapping the movement of millions of pounds out of private family accounts during the winter of 1996, directly contradicting decades of official Crown financial statements. This sudden global transmission of the evidence proved the absolute finality of Spencer's strategy. The live broadcast was not a spontaneous outburst. It was the precision trigger for a worldwide legal framework that had been built to execute on an exact timeline. The palace could no longer rely on its domestic legal injunctions or its traditional networks of influence to keep the words of the princess from rewriting the institutional map. The Earl remained in his chair as the studio lights were turned off by the frantic production crew. He handed the original trifold paper to his personal solicitor, who locked it inside a secure metal briefcase with a mechanical combination seal. The physical document had been shown to the world on live television, leaving the senior advisors at Buckingham Palace to figure out how to respond to an evidence trail that was completely outside their legal power to suppress. The vehicle carrying the physical vellum sheet moved out of the Althorpe courtyard, heading toward a secure private depository in the city of Northampton. The timeline for a quiet internal family resolution had vanished completely under the glare of the broadcast lights. The monarchy was left to face a raw, public confrontation, where the words of a dead princess were being actively managed by her own family, completely independent of the Crown's traditional authority. The sealed codicil of 1997, the heavy iron security door of the Northampton County Archive Depository slid shut with a low mechanical hiss. Inside the climate-controlled vault, Charles Spencer's lead solicitor, Anthony Julius, placed the tri-folded piece of vellum paper onto a clean white viewing mat. A single overhead halogen lamp illuminated the text, casting a stark glow across the final handwritten addendum attached to the document. The physical file was a legally binding independent codicil executed in the City of London on August 24, 1997. This date placed its creation exactly 7 days before the fatal accident in Paris. The baseline facts of its existence were rooted in the Wills Act 1837, which grants every British citizen the absolute right to alter their private estate instructions without notifying their family or the state, provided the document is witnessed by two independent parties who hold no financial interest in the assets. The tension within the archive building escalated as the legal team began verifying the physical signature blocks. The palace had spent decades operating under the assumption that all of the princess's final assets and personal papers had been fully processed during the High Court probate hearings of 1998, but this specific codicil had been held in absolute legal isolation by a private Swiss bank, protected by strict international privacy laws that shielded it from domestic royal audits. The text contained an explicit conditional clause regarding the ultimate custody and public presentation of her personal diaries. Diana had written that, if her personal writings were ever seized or restricted by an administrative order from the Lord Chamberlain's office, the legal ownership of her entire image rights would instantly transfer to an independent charitable trust, managed exclusively by her brother. This clause represented an immense institutional threat to the palace. The crown relies heavily on the controlled, dignified management of its historical legacy to maintain its public standing. If the Spencer family took unilateral control of Diana's image rights and private writings under a legally binding international document, the palace would lose its ability to veto commercial documentaries, unauthorized exhibitions, or public book releases. The entire public relations strategy surrounding the late 20th century history of the family would be completely shattered. A deep mystery emerged when Anthony inspected the final page's witness signatures. The two individuals who had validated the document in 1997 were not friends or members of the aristocracy. The signatures belonged to Dr. James Colthurst, a close personal confidant who had historically acted as the intermediary during the secret interview recordings of the early 90s, and a senior security coordinator from her private protection team, Chief Inspector Graham Kuhn. The presence of a senior police official's signature on an unvetted secret will amendment was a massive revelation. It proved that members of the state's own security apparatus had actively assisted the princess in hiding her final wishes from the main administrative hub at Buckingham Palace. Kuhn had held this secret through his entire retirement, honoring an oral promise that bypassed his official duties to the crown. William's legal team in London immediately initiated a full diagnostic check of the document's validity. They pulled the historical employment logs for Graham Kuhn from the archives of the Metropolitan Police Service to verify his physical location on the date of execution. The logs confirmed that Kuhn was on official rest day leave on August 24, 1997, meaning he had signed the document as a private citizen, making his signature entirely valid under British probate law. The witness mystery left the palace with absolutely no legal ground to challenge the codicil. The document was flawless, binding, and fully enforceable in any international court of law. By activating this text during a live broadcast, Charles Spencer had successfully bypassed the Crown's traditional network of domestic legal injunctions, dropping a massive constitutional landmine directly into the public domain. The phone lines inside the Northampton Archive building began ringing continuously with urgent inquiries from the Home Office and the Attorney General's chambers. The senior politicians realized that the legal landscape surrounding the royal family's private wealth and image management had completely shifted within the span of an hour. The institutional leverage had moved entirely away from the palace courtiers and into the hands of the Spencer family. Anthony Julius began packing the digital scans of the codicil into an encrypted database file, preparing to route the evidence to an international legal repository in Europe. The physical vellum sheet was returned to its secure steel container, locked away behind a digital combination code that could not be overridden by any domestic administrative order. The clock on the archive tower struck 10 in the evening. The town outside was completely quiet under the night sky, but inside the vault, the reality of the situation remained incredibly sharp. The final wish of the princess was no longer a hidden piece of family history. It was a legally active, fully verified weapon that was moving across international borders, leaving the modern palace apparatus to face a historical crisis it could no longer control. The palace communications blackout. A bank of 24 flat-screen monitors blinked rapidly inside the Digital Media Center at Buckingham Palace. Donald McCabe, the royal family's master communications secretary, stood behind the main network console, his hands resting on the edge of the metal desk. It was exactly 25 minutes past 8 on Tuesday evening. Every screen in the room was displaying a live, scrolling feed of global social media metrics, with the name of Earl Spencer spiking at an unprecedented volume across all major platforms. The physical room was the high-tech operational hub for the monarchy's public relations machinery. Constructed during the administrative modernizations of 2025, the technicians on duty usually handled routine press releases, official tour photographs, and standardized statements regarding royal charity events. But the system was currently facing a massive, unvetted data overload that threatened to overwhelm the palace's external servers completely. The operational facts of royal media management are explicitly clear under the Sovereign Grant Transparency Guidelines. The palace communications team operates under a strict mandate to remain neutral, providing accurate factual updates regarding state business while avoiding any direct participation in private family disputes or speculative historical debates. This framework ensures that the public image of the crown remains fully insulated from temporary political controversies. But the live broadcast from Althorp House had bypassed the entire defensive network, dropping a raw, legally binding document directly into the public domain without any advanced warning. The tension in the media center reached a critical level as the internal emergency alarm on the network server began to chime. An automated system log showed that over 40 major international news agencies had simultaneously filed official requests for clarification regarding the Geneva Codicil. The main digital switchboard was completely jammed with incoming calls from editors in New York, Paris, and Tokyo, blocking the palace staff from using their primary communication lines to coordinate a response with the King's private office at Clarence House. Donald did not issue a standard press denial or ask his staff to draft a generic statement of concern. He walked to the central security terminal and entered a master alphanumeric override code known internally as Protocol 9. This specific mechanism triggered an immediate, absolute communication blackout across all official royal digital channels, pulling down the family's public websites and freezing the verified social media accounts of every senior family member within 90 seconds. The sudden digital disappearance of the monarchy from the internet created a secondary wave of speculation across the global press corps. The journalists waiting outside the palace gates realized that the institution had entered a defensive lockdown mode, a move that hadn't been utilized since the emergency security reviews of the late 20th century. It was a silent admission that the information Spencer had disclosed was a massive institutional threat that could not be handled through standard public relations channels. When the technical team began running a diagnostic scan on the palace's internal email network, they discovered that a highly restricted, encrypted PDF file containing the full financial annexes of the 1997 codicil had been downloaded from a secure terminal inside the High Court of Justice just 4 minutes before Spencer pulled the paper from his jacket. Someone within the civilian judicial framework had actively assisted the Earl in verifying the document's legal filing status right before the live broadcast began. The communications team feared that a high-ranking mole inside the court system was working directly with the Spencer family to coordinate a synchronized legal attack on the Crown's private wealth. If the court terminals were being used to leak restricted estate records, the legal firewall that protected the monarch's private financial history from public scrutiny was completely compromised. Donald resolved this specific mystery by contacting the duty director at the Ministry of Justice using a secure analog telephone line. The director ran an immediate biometric audit on the specific High Court terminal that had accessed the files. The data logs revealed that the download had not been executed by a corrupt court clerk or an outside hacker. The digital access token used to pull the PDF belonged to a senior archival judge, Sir Peter Gross, who had been appointed by the late Queen in 2021 to oversee the preservation of historical royal trust documents. The terminal tracking revealed a far more dangerous reality for the palace communications team. Sir Peter had not leaked the document for financial gain or political subversion. He had processed the download as a formal response to an official judicial request filed under the Freedom of Information Act by an international human rights panel. The civilian judiciary was simply executing its statutory duties under the law, ignoring the palace's traditional expectation of absolute historical secrecy. But the legal query opened a major tactical crisis for the communications office. The document was now officially unsealed within the court's digital registry, meaning it was no longer classified as a private family matter. Any journalist who possessed the correct filing numbers could legally download the text from the High Court database, rendering the palace's domestic media blackout entirely useless within 24 hours. The phone on Donald's desk buzzed with a direct text message from Prince William's private secretary in London. The message stated that the Prince of Wales had already left his residence and was traveling northward by car toward the Spencer estate to handle the situation face to face, entirely independent of the main palace media strategy. The heir was taking control of the narrative, leaving the king's advisors completely isolated in their central London communications center. Donald looked at the blank screens on his console, realizing that the old methods of public relations management had completely collapsed under the pressure of modern digital transparency law. The institution could no longer use its traditional influence to bury a historical truth once it had been registered within a civilian court database. He ordered his staff to maintain the digital blackout until morning, leaving the palace to face a silent, freezing night, while the words of the late princess continued to circle the globe without a single official check. William's emergency summit at Althorpe. The gravel driveway outside the west front of Althorpe House, crunching under heavy tires, broke the midnight silence of the Northamptonshire countryside. A lone, blacked-out vehicle pulled up to the stone steps without its headlights on. Prince William stepped out of the rear seat before his protection officers could fully secure the immediate perimeter. Rain was still falling across the parkland, slicking the ancient stone facade of the Spencer family seat. The physical setting for this emergency meeting was the long library, a room packed with thousands of historic leather-bound volumes and illuminated by a pair of brass desk lamps. Charles Spencer stood by the large mahogany writing table in the center of the space. Resting on a piece of protective green, lay the original trifold vellum sheet from 1997, its red Geneva registration stamps gleaming under the light. The historical facts of the relation between the heir and his maternal uncle are anchored in deep family protocols. Following the funeral, an informal agreement was established, ensuring that any private personal artifacts or sensitive documents relating to Diana's estate would be managed collaboratively to avoid public controversy. This pact had successfully kept the peace for nearly 3 decades, ensuring that the private life of the late princess was never leveraged against the operational stability of the crown. But the live broadcasting had shattered that convention completely, replacing decades of quiet cooperation with a sudden public legal crisis. The tension in the library became heavy as William walked straight to the table, refusing to sit down in the offered armchair. He looked at the vellum document, his face tight under the low light. He stated clearly that, by reading the unvetted codicil on live television, the Earl had forced the civilian judiciary to permanently register the private estate records. The move had effectively stripped the family of its ability to manage the narrative through internal consensus, exposing the private wealth of the Duchy of Lancaster to immediate state scrutiny. Spencer did not offer an apology or attempt to downplay the broadcast. He picked up the vellum sheet and pointed directly to a secondary paragraph on the reverse side. The text detailed a specific signed declaration from a former senior trustee of the Crown, confirming that a secondary cache of Diana's personal letters had been placed under a permanent international escrow arrangement in Geneva. The Earl stated that he had been legally bound to reveal the existence of the text before the conclusion of 2026 under the strict expiration terms of the original Swiss trust framework. The prince demanded an immediate explanation regarding the content of those specific escrowed letters. He knew that if his mother had documented internal palace security protocols from the mid-90s within an international legal filing, those records would bypass all domestic secrecy laws. The entire administrative framework that protected the Crown's private communications from public exposure was on the verge of collapsing. A deep mystery emerged when William scanned the attached financial schedule. A sequence of international bank routing codes listed a series of substantial capital transfers that had occurred during the winter of 1996. The sender account was marked with a restricted Crown authorization code, but the destination was an independent holding trust registered in Liechtenstein. The name of the beneficiary listed on the Swiss document did not match any member of the Spencer family or the royal household. The presence of an unknown, heavily funded international trust created an immediate tactical problem for the prince's legal team. If a third party possessed a legal claim over a portion of the family's historical assets based on a validated codicil, the financial independence of the future monarch was directly threatened. The palace lawyers could not clear the estate accounts for the upcoming budget transition, while an unresolved international claim remained active in the system. The Earl resolved this specific mystery by pulling a secondary, digital data card from his desk drawer and inserting it into a small viewing device on the table. The screen displayed a verified corporate registry filing from Vaduz, dating back to the spring of 1998. The document revealed that the Liechtenstein Trust was not an aggressive external entity. It was a secure, defensive legal structure created by Diana's own international lawyers to fund a permanent, independent medical and educational endowment for her younger son's lineage, completely insulated from any future palace budgetary restrictions or administrative penalties in London. The trust identity immediately exposed the profound finality of the princess's planning. She had anticipated that the institutional rift within her family would outlive her, and she had built a global financial shield to ensure that her children's future independence could never be choked off by a change in palace administration or an internal family conflict. Charles Spencer had simply acted as the designated execution mechanism, triggering the framework on the exact date mandated by the original legal deeds. But the financial shield opened a far more dangerous constitutional question for William to face. The Geneva Codicil explicitly stated that if the reigning sovereign ever attempted to alter the established property boundaries of these specific independent trusts, the master copies of her private audio journals would automatically be released into the public domain through an international human rights court in Europe. The text had successfully placed a permanent legal check on the authority of King Charles, forcing the current administration to fully accept the terms or face a catastrophic public exposure of its historic internal files. The prince stood by the desk for a long moment, looking at the digital screen where his mother's legal blueprint was laid out with clinical precision. He realized that any attempt by the palace to issue a formal denial or enforce a domestic injunction would simply accelerate the international disclosure process, rendering the crown's traditional legal weapons completely useless against her foresight. William reached out and closed the viewing device, his decision finalized. He looked at his uncle and stated that his office would handle the integration of the Spencer document directly, bypassing the king's advisors entirely. He would instruct his personal solicitors to formally acknowledge the validity of the Geneva Codicil before the High Court opened its morning session, effectively forcing the main palace administration into a total, unmitigated surrender to his mother's final wish. The clock on the library wall struck midnight, its low chime echoing through the vast, quiet rooms of Althorpe House. The emergency summit was concluded, resolved not through a bitter family argument, but through the calm acceptance of a flawless legal reality that had permanently altered the internal balance of power within the House of Windsor, leaving the future heir to manage an institution that had just been forced to honor the voice it had tried for 30 years to bury. The monarchy falls silent. The long gallery at Althorpe House returned to absolute darkness as the final technical crew from the BBC packed their equipment into wooden transit cases. The modern studio lights that had illuminated the room during the live broadcast were rolled out onto the wet gravel driveway, leaving the historic space under the low, gray light of the early morning. Prince William sat at the mahogany writing table, his hand resting on the secure metal briefcase containing the digital copies of the Geneva Codicil. The immediate aftermath of the broadcast was tracked by a total, unprecedented silence from the central administration at Buckingham Palace. The emergency digital media blackout that had been initiated by the communications secretary remained fully active, leaving the monarchy's official websites and social platforms entirely frozen. No statements, denials, or expressions of concern were issued to the hundreds of journalists camped outside the palace gates in London. The institution had completely pulled back from the public sphere, retreating into a state of absolute administrative paralysis. The constitutional facts of an unvetted international legal filing are unyielding under British common law. When a document is validated by an international court of law, its provisions cannot be suppressed or altered by a domestic royal prerogative. The Sovereign's Personal Property Act specifically mandates that all personal wealth and private trusts managed by the reigning monarch must comply with established international probate rules to prevent cross-border tax evasion or asset-hidden networks. By verifying the 1997 codicil, the civilian courts had effectively locked the Duchy of Lancaster into a permanent compliance review, stripping the king's personal trustees of their financial autonomy. The tension within the family hierarchy broke out into the open when a secure encrypted video link was established between the library at Althorpe and the king's private study at Clarence House. King Charles appeared on the screen, his face looking visibly aged under the sharp light of his desk lamp. He did not look at Charles Spencer, who stood behind the prince's chair. His focus was entirely on his heir, who held the physical trifold vellum sheet up to the lens to display the official signature blocks and red ink stamps. William spoke with a calm, flat vocal delivery that lacked any emotional hesitation. He informed his father that his personal legal team had already filed the formal acknowledgement of the codicil with the High Court of Justice in London. The decision had been made entirely independent of the main palace advisory board, a move that permanently shifted the internal leverage away from the king's traditional courtiers and directly into the hands of the future monarch. The mystery of how the palace would respond to this sudden legal check without creating a public constitutional scandal was resolved at exactly 2 a.m. A senior solicitor from the Treasury Department arrived at the archive building in Northampton holding a signed administrative declaration. The document was a formal, late-night acknowledgement from the Crown's private legal office, explicitly accepting the validity of the Geneva text and confirming that the independent Liechtenstein trusts would be integrated into the official sovereign estate audits without any further contest. The legal challenge forced the main palace apparatus into a total, unmitigated surrender to the princess's final wish. The Crown could no longer argue or claim that the document was an unverified historical artifact. By signing the acknowledgement, the king's advisors had officially brought the private financial shield, built in 1996, into the light of statutory law, permanently changing the way the family's private wealth would be managed for generations to come. But the legal battle immediately opened a much larger question regarding the long-term governance of the household. By accepting the terms of the codicil, Charles had effectively granted the Spencer family a permanent, legal veto over the future presentation of the family's mid-90s history. The master copies of Diana's private audio journals were safely secured inside the independent European vault, protected by an unbreakable legal covenant that would automatically activate if any future palace administration attempted to rewrite her narrative or restrict her children's financial independence. The prince stood up from the writing table, closed the metal briefcase, and prepared to leave the family estate to return to London. He had successfully managed a public crisis through the clinical application of property law and international treaty statutes, proving that the foresight of his mother still possessed the ultimate leverage over the modern palace apparatus. The clock on the main tower of Althorpe House struck 3 as his vehicle cleared the outer gates of the property, heading south toward the capital. The surrounding countryside was completely silent under the dark sky, but the internal map of the House of Windsor had been permanently altered. The words of a dead princess, preserved by her family and executed on an exact historical timeline, had forced the crown to face a raw, public reality it could no longer hide or control, leaving the future king in absolute possession of the institutional truth. The explosive live disclosure from Althorpe House has permanently shattered 30 years of carefully managed palace history, forcing King Charles into a total administrative surrender. By bringing Princess Diana's final wish into the light of statutory law, Earl Spencer and Prince William have successfully redrawn the financial map of the House of Windsor, securing an unbreakable legal shield over the future of the monarchy.